When we arrived in Perugia very late last night, close to 3 in the morning, we actually arrived right here, parked basically right here, parked there actually. That was close to, as I say, 3 in the morning. It was an exhausting 15.5-hour drive. A lot of that was just being stuck in traffic. The moment I opened my car door, right, and the first time I opened my car door, the first thing I smelled was marijuana. And then it was like Halloween, obviously, and then there were students kind of coming down there, coming down here, very active party kind of going on, even at almost 3 o'clock in the morning. And they were actively streaming down kind of in groups and then kind of coming together. These sort of ancient alleys were sort of echoing with laughter and revelry, and of course, since it was Halloween, there was an added sense of fun, added sense of playfulness, and people looking for pleasure late at night. Although this analysis deals with another major driver, another critical aspect undermining poor Meredith's murder, and by the way, just so you know, today is the day that she was murdered 17 years ago, November 1st. It was a couple of hours from now, if I look at the time, 10 past 3 right now, it's around about 6 hours from now, 6 to 7 hours from now. Although this analysis deals with another major driver, another crucial aspect undermining poor Meredith's murder, and I mean, it's now 10 past 3 it's November 1st. It's actually this day that it happened, probably around about 6 hours from now. But that critical driver is sex. And one aspect I failed to mention in terms of the drugs narrative is the fact that Follain also mentions on page 26 of A Death in Italy that Meredith saw 2 men smoking out in the open, probably more on that side, not far from Sophie's home, not only smoking heroin but openly cooking it. Meredith also found used syringes lying in the grass in the garden of their cottage. I do find many of the recent comments minimizing the drug narrative to no more than harmless marijuana use, and only that, well, that's the reason why 17 years later the Knox case remains so misunderstood.
That unfolded here at the house last November.
Amanda Knox and her ex-boyfriend face murder and sexual violence charges in connection with the death of 21-year-old British student Meredith Kircher.
Well, the house where Meredith was murdered still holds its secrets. Their case being watched so closely in Italy, America, and Britain. Who is Amanda Knox? Is she the innocent, fun-loving American student she claims? Or a debauched and ruthless young woman?
If you can't even see the importance of the drug narrative after 17 years, well, perhaps you never will. And then you might as well give up going even further, trying to fathom the deeper, more difficult, subtler levels and layers of this case. For example, the sex narrative.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science.
La voce più autentica del vero crimine.
So let's deal with the sex narrative, starting with number 1. Let's talk about sex.
No one can really explain the exact sequence of events that unfolded here at the house last November.
Amanda Knox and her ex-boyfriend face murder and sexual violence charges in connection with the death of 21-year-old British student Meredith Kircher.
Now, John Follain, the author of A Death in Italy, in less than 60 pages, and in fact in just the first 60 pages of his book, when he introduces Kircher and Knox, before he even deals with the crime or the investigation, he provides a great deal of insight but more specifically contrast, where he juxtaposes these issues, the attitudes to drugs and sex, as well as maturity, different levels of maturity between the two young women, and the results predictably are surprising and unsettling. Amanda Knox has rightly accused the media of unfairly accusing her and maligning her in terms of her admitted appetite and attitude to sex. She's right. She's allowed to express herself or engage in the sort of behavior she wishes to indulge in or participate in. And let's face it, as a student, it's virtually a rite of passage. Unfortunately, the sex narrative typically ends there. It ends with Knox as a victim, a modern scarlet letter scenario where Knox was the victim of prudes who didn't like how promiscuous she was, and the media came up with a cruel taunt, referring to her as Foxy Knoxy. How cruel, how unkind. In fact, the whole scarlet letter thing has been so effective for Knox, she seems to be making content using those terms in order to fix this idea in the public mindset. In other words, in a classic Darvo move, Knox is now shaming the public and the media for daring to point the finger at her.
Amanda Knox, once known around the world as Foxy Knoxy, has a new mission, standing up for women who, like her, have been publicly shamed and attacked in the media, part of a new project called The Scarlet Letter Reports, a Vice Media docuseries.
I'm Amanda Knox, and I too have been subjected to harassment and death threats.
But reality turns out to be a little different. Rather than being cruelly and unfairly maligned with the Foxy Knoxy moniker, that was something Knox came up with, or rather something that she called herself on her MySpace page. In fact, the name of her profile on MySpace was Foxy Knoxy. This is something she sneakily avoids mentioning while blaming the media for supposedly making fun of her and apparently coming up with that name. They came up with that name, right? And, fixating on Knox's uninhibited sex life and the Foxy Knoxy nickname is essentially the beginning and end of the typical analysis in this area, in this sort of area of the sexual narrative involving this case. And so you kind of got to ask the question, what is wrong with Knox's sex life?
Wrong question.
When we get to know Knox in this area, we tend to neglect Meredith's interest in the very same area. And that brings us to number 2, the right question to ask within the sexual narrative. The question we must ask is, how does Knox's approach to sex compare to Meredith's? And also to compare Knox's approach to men to Meredith's as well, just as we did during the drug narrative. And that requires us to go beyond cliches and cheap superficial epithets like Foxy Knoxy and the Scarlet Letter, all that stuff. Now we have to do the much harder job, which is to try to get to know these young women as people, as individuals. But that's not a very long walk in the park either. It turns out Amanda wasn't as sexually advanced and mature as she seemed. So much so that Meredith told her friends that she actually felt sorry for her. Now, you might say Meredith was a prude or antisocial, and there's a little truth to both of those, because Meredith did sometimes like alone time. But even Meredith's friends were put off by Knox, and more particularly by her oddball sexuality. On Knox's Facebook page, now scrubbed, Knox declared herself as someone who had no or very few inhibitions. How many people do you know who would put in their own sort of profile on social media that they would say, a lot of my friends say I'm a hippie, but I am thinking I'm just weird. I don't get embarrassed and therefore have very few social inhibitions. I love new situations and I love to meet new people. The bigger and scarier the roller coaster, the better. Now, what do you think that translates to if you are saying it's your own self-declaration, the bigger and scarier the roller coaster, the better? How does that translate to, let's say, sexual experimentation? How does that translate to drug experimentation. And think about what we're talking about here. If you say the bigger and scarier the roller coaster, the better, what you're really disclosing is your own appetite for what? Well, for risk. And what do you think Meredith's appetite was for risk in terms of these same aspects, the sex side and the drug side? Do you think it was the same as Knox's? Do you think it was as high risk? Do you think she was looking for the same big and scary roller coaster as Knox was looking for? Also on her Facebook site, and this is highlighted by Follain in his book, he says, Amanda filled in the section interested in with a single word, men. Of her relationship status, she wrote, it's complicated. Now, before you judge Meredith, what is your opinion on this? And again, it is quoting from Follain's book. In her diary, Amanda listed all the things she had to do before setting off for Italy. Number 1, sex store, she wrote. In the packing list was a reminder to include condoms. She talked to DJ about their relationship. While she would be in Perugia, he would be on a long stay in China. They agreed that each of them would be free to have other relationships while they were overseas. And that brings us to number 3. Nox's sexuality rubbed Meredith the wrong way. More importantly, regardless of what's appropriate or not, the emotional reality was that Nox's sexuality in particular rubbed Meredith the wrong way. How do we know that? Well, because she said so. And this is the part that's important to remember, and that I think a lot of people go down this alleyway and end up sort of going nowhere, end up in a cul-de-sac, end up in a dead end. We are not here to evaluate either Nox's sexuality or Meredith's, and most people do. Most people say, I'm a lot like Amanda Knox. And others say, I'm a lot like Meredith. That's not really what we're supposed to be doing. What we need to be doing is determining the true dynamic in this case as it was, not through how we interpret it, how they interpreted it, how they experienced it, as well as the true dynamic that played into Meredith's murder. Like, how did that dynamic play into Meredith's murder, if at all? And the fact is, Meredith felt embarrassed listening to Knox talk about sex. Again, we know this because Meredith said so. And again, Follain does a brilliant job digging beneath the surface to get to this dynamic, which is really not that easy to get to. He writes the following. Once, Meredith told Sophie, that's a friend of Meredith's, that Amanda asked her to help her put some makeup on. Amanda rarely wore any and asked for some advice on how to do her hair. I'm not good at girly things like that, Amanda had said. Insecure or not, Amanda spoke openly about men and her sex life to Meredith, so much so that Meredith felt embarrassed listening to her. Amanda told her that she had no problem being seen nude, and that in America she had once talked to her friend's boyfriend even though she was stark naked. Now again, is that something you would do? Do you have friends who would do the same thing? Now, she also told a shocked Meredith that she had an erotic dream, written it up and sent it to DJ. Now, you might think about that one way or another, but I think you've also got to think about, is that something you communicate to someone you don't really know? Anyway, Meredith talked about Amanda's sexuality with her friend Sophie. For Meredith, it was strange the way Amanda would meet a man and be straight away very full on. Either spending lots of hours with him, in terms of barely knowing him and then spending a heck of a lot of time with him, or sort of jumping the gun and sleeping with him very soon. Now, again, you don't have to agree or disagree. You just have to know that this was a serious issue playing into the dynamic in the run-up to Meredith's murder. Number 4, who actually won the sexual competition? So if you actually put Amanda Knox on one side and Meredith Kirch on the other, and you say, okay, they're in a sexual competition with one another, well, who won that competition ultimately? What do you think the answer is? Who do you think felt she was in a competition? Who do you think didn't feel she was in a competition? And who do you think actually won that competition? Again, whether or not you prefer Knox's extroverted approach or Meredith's more conservative approach, the reality is that one of the boys in the villa downstairs, Giacomo Salenzi, he preferred Meredith. Also, Patrick Lumumba preferred Meredith, and Meredith's friends didn't like and basically rejected Knox, and that should tell you a great deal as well. Regardless of which approach suited which girl, what or who did the guy in this equation, Giacomo Salenzi, a guy both girls fancied, both Amanda and Meredith liked him, right? Well, what is the guy who fancied both girls as well? Well, who did he pick? Who did he choose at the end of the day? And why? Well, the answer is that he chose Meredith. So Meredith actually won the sexual competition. Now, how do you think the other person in that equation felt about that? Have you ever been in a sexual competition and lost? Number 5, opposites don't attract. So what we've discovered is if Knox's approach is about open relationships, no strings attached, and being promiscuous, Meredith was the exact opposite. She wasn't sure even if she even wanted to be in a relationship. She wanted to focus on her studies. But when she felt herself falling for one of the boys downstairs, Giacomo, a boy Knox also fancied, Meredith was concerned about Giacomo's commitment. Now again, you would ask yourself, do you think that's something Knox would have concerned herself with? And I think that shows a big difference between Meredith and Amanda Knox. So at one point she said, to be honest, there's a boy I like very, very much. I think I'm almost in love with him, but I can't make him out. When we're alone together, he's very nice and gentle with me. But if we meet in the street, he barely says hello. So you can see that Meredith is actually quite a deep person. She's not superficial. She's someone who is kind of sensitive. Personally, I think the fact that Giacomo chose Meredith over Knox was a huge blow to Knox's already fragile insecurities. Now, also think about this idea if you at university, and this is the time where you test your sexual power in terms of, people that you're hoping to attract. Well, what happens if you fail that test? What happens if someone basically shows themselves to have greater agency than you do? What does that feel like? In other words, in this arena where you're supposed to demonstrate your sexual power, sexual ability, and instead you fail to demonstrate that, how does that feel? Now also, if you add to that Meredith herself and Meredith's friends freezing Knox out, you can see how insecurity and inadequacy could lead to feelings of envy, impotency, jealousy, and even rage. And you must remember, if you're living with someone who's making you feel that way, it can feel even more kind of serious. It can be something that is kind of in your face and something that you can't kind of escape in a way. And so if you assuage these feelings with drugs, right, if you try to soothe these feelings with drugs, not marijuana, but the big stuff, let's say like cocaine, well, what could go wrong? And this is where the excess that is part of Italian culture, I think, comes into it. If you're wanting to indulge, let's say in sex and drugs, let's say you want to indulge, but specifically in terms of these two aspects, and you come to Italy and an Italian student town on top of that, it is likely to put those indulgences into overdrive. Number 6, culture clash. Why are all Ferraris red? Think about that. What is the point of a Ferrari and why must it be a red Ferrari? And driving through Italy, we've seen quite a few Ferraris come down the road and they're red. What's the story with that? Why is Italy about being hot-blooded, about good food, about passion? Well, it's because people differ. And some people love that about Italy. Some people find it a little much, right? And the fact is, cultures differ. countries differ. I think when Meredith comes to Italy, she appreciates the history, the culture, kind of the art aspect, all of those things. But someone else can come here and not really be that interested in things like history, but be more interested in the vibe, the energy, the sexuality, the kind of indulgent attitude to seeking pleasure or chasing after pleasure. And I mean, in that sense, countries differ. And this is a list of the most promiscuous countries in the world. Have a look at where Italy is, but also take note of the United Kingdom and the United States. And by the way, South Africa is there as well. Would you say Knox is a typical American when it comes to promiscuity? Is Meredith a typical Brit in that respect? Are there any photos of Knox and Meredith in the same picture? That's also an interesting question. If you're going to say, you know what, I think this is really overblown. They lived together, they got along. Well, are there any photos of the two young women in the same picture? Well, where are they? I mean, they lived together for quite a while. And this suggests that two girls really didn't get along after all, not even in a superficial sense of taking photos with one another. Number 7, do sex and drugs go hand in hand? What do you think? Do drugs and sex go hand in hand? Do sex and drugs go hand in hand?
No one can really explain the exact sequence of events that unfolded here at the house last November.
So there's one remaining aspect we need to incorporate here, and that's the compounding effect of the one driver on the other. Well, the possibility of that. Firstly, are excessive drug users excessively promiscuous as well? Well, the statistics say yes. And look at this article, Elements from Elements. It says promiscuity linked to drug addiction. It deals with a study that came out of New Zealand, and they say the biggest connection between sexual behaviors and substance abuse was seen in women. Women in the study who had more than 2 or 3 partners while in their teens were 10 times more likely to develop a drug addiction or drinking problem by the age of 21. And we know that Knox was 20. She was just barely out of her teenage phase. Women with multiple partners in their early 20s were 7 times more likely to have an addiction by 26. And most strikingly, women with multiple partners in their late 20s were 18 times more at risk by the age of 32. Now that we've made the case about Nox's sexuality vis-a-vis Meredith's, what's also interesting to note is that at a certain point in October, a few days, perhaps even a week or two prior to Meredith's murder, Knox said that she was going to spend time exclusively with Italians. Now, although this appears to be Knox making an assertive decision, that she's going to kind of be independent, right? It wouldn't surprise me if she made the decision as a response to Meredith and her friends basically rejecting her. It's almost like them saying, well, we're not really going to spend time with her, and Knox basically saying, well, I'd rather spend time with the Italians anyway. It's kind of a similar thing to what she said about Giacomo, where she said to Meredith something like, he likes me, but you can have him. Of course, then Halloween came along, and by then Knox was basically on the outs with Meredith and the British girls. And then it was too late and too much water under the bridge to get back on the party train. And I imagine on November 1st, this must have really stung Amanda Knox when she wanted to sort of come back out of the cold and kind of have fun with the other expats, only to not be able to do that. And we also know that Halloween was a huge deal to Amanda Knox. The other aspect to consider is that for all of Knox's bluster about sexual freedom, within days of Meredith starting a relationship with Giacomo, Knox was suddenly in a relationship as well. And we know Knox was someone who, and you must think about this not as an adult, but as someone who's becoming an adult. Knox was someone who modeled herself on other people, imitated other people. She kind of apparently hero worshipped Laura, one of the girls in the villa. And within days of meeting Laura, she copied Laura's ear piercings, where I think she put the same number of ear piercings Laura had in her own ears. She also wanted to borrow Laura's guitar. And one also wonders whether Meredith suddenly starting a relationship with Giacomo didn't kind of trigger, if that's the word, a response from Knox to suddenly be in a relationship as well. And again, we're dealing with a sexual competition here. Apparently, she was committed to and in love with Solicitor, but the crazy part is, after all the nonsense about Knox's liberal approaches to sex and interest in one-night stands and no-string sex, now suddenly the opposite situation seems to be happening. Now she's in a committed relationship with a boy she's just met, and I think slept with on the night they met as well. Well, is it working out? And who is the lucky Romeo here, right? What's the quality of the guy that Knox has met? And how does Meredith's beau compare to Knox's? I think that's also quite an interesting point. Do you think Meredith would want to go out with a guy like Solicitor? Well, Solicitor, by his own admission in his memoir, Honor Bound, he's an extremely inexperienced and awkward dude himself. And Knox apparently is his first girlfriend. By the way, that is how Knox's family described Knox at the time as well, as not street smart at all. She was described as, she would have the same breakfast every day. She led quite a regimented life. All you had to do was tell her to stop doing homework and go to bed, and she would do that. And I think her sister said she was not very street smart, right? And that she doesn't always pick up on social cues. So put that couple side by side with Giacomo and Meredith on the one hand, and also put the respective drug narratives of each couple side by side and see if there might be a difference. Is there? And how would you feel on November 1st, today is November 1st, if your housemate had gone partying with all her friends without you, and the dishy housemate downstairs had chosen her and not you, and Knox's boss preferred Meredith as well? And what if you made all the other self-effacing comparisons that showed Knox she couldn't compete with her housemate? How would she feel? Now, as a mature person, you might say it wouldn't really bother me, but I think it would really bother you in the scenario where you are asserting yourself and other people are asserting themselves, and you are the status quo is being determined and being decided, and other people are looking in as well and deciding and noticing what is going on. And that is where Knox was emotionally and psychologically on November 1st.
No one can really explain the exact sequence of events that unfolded here at the house last November.
Later that night on November 1st, 17 years ago, and that is around about, around about 3 hours from now, 17 years ago, Meredith Kircher was brutally murdered in her bedroom. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.